England's last executed witch, Alice Molland, was hanged at Exeter Castle in Devon in 1685. But could it be possible that she survived? According to court records, a woman named Alice Molland was accused and found guilty of performing witchcraft on the bodies of Joan Snow, Wilmot Snow, and Alice Furs. She was hanged to death in March of 1685 and holds the distinction of being the last woman hanged as a witch in England. She certainly wasn't the last to be arrested and accused of performing witchcraft, just the last executed. And of course, we're just focusing on England here today. Over in the US, the Salem witch trials hadn't even happened yet, so witchcraft isn't done, but she was the last one executed in England. But according to historian Mark Stoyle of the University of Southampton, it's possible that Alice Molland was actually Avis Molland, who was not executed as a witch and actually died a free woman in 1693. If true, then that means that the Bideford Three, which is Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards, all of Devon, were the last to be executed 3 years earlier in 1682. So for today's AF-Out Mini, let's look into this story and Professor Stoyle's research. As usual, we'll do a little bit of my favorite, historical context. What was the state of witchcraft and witch hunts in 17th century England? Why were these ladies the last witches to be executed? When did witch hunting die down in England, and is there any merit to Professor Stoyle's theory that Alice Molland was not the last executed witch of England? Now, I've done a full podcast episode on witchcraft in England, focusing on the Pendle Witches, England's most famous witch trial in 1612. That dropped back in October 2024, just in time for Halloween. And in that episode, I provided some context on the state of witchcraft in the early 17th century, that's the 1600s. Though witch hunting and witch trials had occurred sporadically throughout the late medieval and early modern period in England, things really ramped up in 1603 when James I took the throne. To be brief, James was super into witch hunting. He instituted the death penalty to anyone even remotely involved in witchcraft, regardless of whether or not the accused witch may have even killed anyone or just hurt them a little bit. Didn't matter. He also allowed for dubious hearsay evidence to convict, and he even allowed the testimonies of children. So a lot of these women, of course, probably had nothing to do with witchcraft, even witchcraft things like fortune-telling, right? And they were executed anyway, and a few men as well. Now, James even wrote a treatise on witchcraft called the Demonology, which is the science of demons, calling witchcraft a high treason against God. His stance on witchcraft and the uptick in ensuing witch trials are defining events of his tenure as the King of England. For more information on the finer details of all of that, go listen to my episode on the Pendle Witches. So witch hunting carried on throughout the 17th century, emboldened by King James's tough stance on it. But another event that impacted witch hunting in this century was the English Civil Wars. Conflicts between those who were loyal to the king, who at the time was Charles I, and those who were loyal to Parliament. It was a political and religious conflict that ended up seeing King Charles beheaded, the fall of the English monarchy, the temporary rise of Oliver Cromwell and his Protectorate, and then the re-establishment of the monarchy under Charles II 11 years later. It was, frankly, an absolute hot mess of a century for the English. I went over it in more detail in my episode on the Great Plague and Great Fire of London, 1665 to 1666, also in the crazy 17th century, so if you're interested in more, go check out that episode too. So what does all this political and religious upheaval have to do with Alice Molland? Well, that's the beauty of historical context. When you've got a country at war with itself and falling apart, with all aspects of life impacted, whether it's society or politics, no doubt the economy, definitely religion. I mean, the king got his head lopped off, and there was no English monarchy for 11 years, right? Then you will no doubt see chaos reign. And in times where chaos reigns, fear and suspicion are going to be on the rise. And the easy and weak thing to do when you're scared is to point the blame at someone else, right? I mean, how many times have we seen people scapegoated for things throughout history? My brain, because it practically lives in the 14th century, goes immediately to the Jews of Strasbourg, who were blamed for causing the plague, the Black Death, right, by poisoning the wells. And on Valentine's Day, 1349, around 1,000 of them were rounded up and burned to death. Go listen to my episode on the Black Death if you, like me, are obsessed with this kind of stuff. My point here is that because of the instability of the 17th century, beginning with intense witch hunts under James I, trials and executions like what happened with the Pendle witches, and then the ramped up chaos of the English Civil Wars, people blamed witches for what was happening. And just for fun, it's also in this period, the mid-17th century, that we get Matthew Hopkins, who was the witch-finder general. He was paid to gallivant across the country, root out witches, force them to confess, and then have them hanged. It was like a smaller-scale Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
And it was mocked in the first season of Blackadder with the witch smeller Pursuvian. A little bit more historical context, we get a better sense of why these women, Alice Molland and the Bideford three before her, were hanged in the 1680s. So traditionally, Alice Molland holds the title of the last executed witch in England, but recently, Mark Stoyle has theorized that perhaps she wasn't actually killed, and the records are incorrect. And all because the scribe, who wrote down the jail records, might have gotten one letter wrong. Here's what Professor Stoyle thinks might have happened. Quote, "Court records from the 17th century were written in Latin, and in this form it would only have taken a single misstroke of the clerk of the court's pen to transform Avisia, Avis, into Alicia, Alice. Almost nothing is known about Alice's life, and attempts to illuminate it have failed. So when I saw reference to an Avis Molland in local archives, knowing Molland was an unusual name in Exeter, I was struck by its close resemblance. I immediately asked myself, did Alice Molland ever exist? Is Alice, in fact, Avis?" End quote. Professor Stoyle did a ton of research into Alice Molland and couldn't really find much about her. The name Alicia Molland pops up in jail records for 1685, along with the 3 people she was accused of practicing witchcraft on. It mentions that she was tried and hanged, and that's about it. We don't have any other records. We don't even have evidence that her execution took place. Stoyle cites other historians who pointed out that had her execution taken place, it likely would have been recorded in another source somewhere. But as far as we know, for records that have survived, we don't have anything to corroborate the jail records. So was Alice Molland the last executed witch in England? We don't really know. It's possible that the records are wrong, and Alice was actually Avis, who wasn't hanged to death. And if that's the case, then the last executed witches in England were Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards, the so-called Bideford Three, who were convicted mainly on hearsay evidence. But at least their trial and hanging was properly documented, so we know for sure that they existed, and they were hanged as accused witches. And there were other women in the ensuing years who might have been put to death as witches, but we have no concrete evidence of them being the last executed, which is why Alice Molland usually gets that title. As Professor Stoyle notes, quote, "By the time of the 1685 trial, Avis Molland was a poor, middle-aged widow who was burdened with loss, precisely the kind of woman who is likely to be accused of witchcraft in early modern England. The lack of records for Alice's life and the circumstantial evidence in support of the case for Avis being our condemned woman points to a witch that lived. But the truth is, despite all my diligent searching, we may never know for sure whether history has got it wrong." End quote. So there we are. Perhaps Alice Molland wasn't the last executed witch. But the bigger story, I suppose, isn't necessarily who wins that title. It's about recognizing that any woman who was middle-aged or elderly, on the outskirts of society, or poor or widowed, was unjustly targeted, hunted down, tried, sometimes tortured into confession, and then hanged. All because they were easy scapegoats in a chaotic, superstitious period of history. But some of you may be wondering, if the witch hunts were going on so strongly in the 17th century, again that's the 1600s, then why were the last witch hangings in the 1680s? Why did it stop then and not much later, right? Well, we need more historical context to help answer that one. I love historical context. By the 1680s in England, we've got two big intellectual movements changing our understanding of all aspects of life. First, the Scientific Revolution, and then the Enlightenment. The Scientific Revolution, though it began in the 1500s, was in full steam by the end of the 1600s. Many of the Scientific Revolution's main players, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Galileo Galilei, had all lived, published their works, and died before Alice Molland's supposed execution. The world of science and math was changing. And especially with men like René Descartes, who bridged the intellectual changes happening in the sciences over to things like philosophy, people were starting to question not just math and science and whether we revolved around the sun or the other way around, but society, government, and the economy. The Enlightenment took off in England in 1680, just a few years before the last witch executions. Men like John Locke believed that we are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and should exercise those rights in government. Suddenly, people are trying to employ logic, reason, and rationality to the things they cannot explain in their life. So we're moving past the era of blaming the unknown on superstitions, on magic, and on witchcraft. And this all culminated in the Witchcraft Act of 1735, when witchcraft prosecutions officially ended in England. Now, it was still a crime to perform any kind of witchcraft, like fortune-telling, but at least the hunts were over, and as England moved forward into the Enlightenment, and then shortly after the Industrial period, the world of witch hunting became just a relic of history. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this AF-Out Mini on the fate of England's last witch. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis, or maybe one of my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.